Hello, and welcome to Online with SFFP, the first of season 2 in our ongoing web series. I'm Victoria Jashab, Secretary of the Board, and if you've joined us before, welcome back. If you're new here, a little background. San Francisco Film Preserve is dedicated to restoring and preserving and making films of all kinds available both online and in person. We completed some wonderful projects in our first year, and our second year is looking to be even more exciting. So I invite you to follow us on Instagram at SF Film Preserve to learn about upcoming projects and events. You can also visit our website, filmpreserve.org, where many of our online events and restorations are available for viewing, and as well as on our YouTube and Vimeo channels. So please take a look, and thanks so much for joining us. Today's presentation should be of particular interest to anyone who is a fan of 1920s fashion, silent film, film history, and Hollywood glamour. Goddesses in the Machine, Fashion in American Silent Film, takes us on a deep dive into the era when film costuming became part of cinematic storytelling. It also serves as a sneak peek of an exhibit of the same name that will be at the Bard Graduate Center in New York later in the year. Both today's event and that exhibit are curated by today's speaker, Michelle Finamore, who is a PhD, a fashion and design curator, author, and historian, and whose exhibits include the forthcoming Shoe Stories at Historic New England, Fashioning America, Grit to Glamour, Gender Bending Fashion, and Hollywood Glamour, Fashion and Jewelry from the Silver Screen. She is the author of Hollywood Before Glamour, Fashion in American Silent Film, as well as numerous articles and papers on costume, fashion, and design. So there will be time for questions after the presentation, so feel free to put them in the Q&A. And now it is my great pleasure to present Michelle Finamore. Thanks.
Thank you, Victoria. I want to thank the San Francisco Film Preserve and Robert Byrne and also Kathy Rosa Regan for inviting me. I'm very, very excited to be here and share this exhibition. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And if you can give me just like a heartbeat, 1 minute to see what's happening here. Sorry, share. There we go. To get it into slide mode. And then we can get going. Okay. There we go. Okay, I think that's working. So anyway, my name is Michelle Finamore. I'm a fashion and design curator and historian. I'm super excited to be talking about this exhibition, which is opening in September of this year, called Goddesses in the Machine, Fashion in American Silent Film. I have to do a shout out to my fabulous co-curator and co-editor, Emma Cormack, who works for Bard and who has been with me the entire way. So I think she's here in the room somewhere, and I'm really excited to be moving forward with this with her. So just as a little background, this is the cover of the book. So I'm going to be giving you a sneak peek of the content of the exhibition, talk a little bit about the journey of how we got to where we are. This has been something that has been on my mind for a long time. I did my PhD work at the Bard Graduate Center, which you see here on the left. And I did my dissertation on fashion and silent film, and then eventually published this book that Victoria mentioned. And so that was published quite a while ago. So this whole project has been about 20 years in the making, and it's really super exciting to kind of see it come into material form, which I think, as many of you know, is not very easy given the subject. So I just wanted to start the presentation with a little anecdote about this movie from 1923 called Look Your Best, which starred the film flapper Colleen Moore. There's a lobby card as well as a glass slide here showing the image, one of the stills from the film. What was really interesting about this film is that Colleen Moore, in an oral history interview, said she played a mermaid, and she described her outfit, which you see here, as skin-tight slacks covered with wonderful gelatin sequins. So she dove into the pool, did her performance. And when she tried to emerge, all of the gelatin sequins dissolved. And so she was only left with what she called a cheesecloth something. So it was kind of like the skeleton of the garment remained and everything else had dissolved. And what I like about this kind of anecdote is that it captures the ephemerality of what we're trying to recapture in this exhibition. Because as many of you know, as silent film aficionados, and fashion historians who are on this screen, I mean, have joined us today as well. Both fashion and film from this era are incredibly volatile, incredibly fragile, and very, very ephemeral. So the notion of trying to reconstruct that history has been a little bit challenging, but we're really trying to kind of get at that magic and bring the film and the fashion together. So the title is drawn from a description in an article from in 1913. Paul Poiret, who was a very famous Paris couturier, came to New York and he brought with him a film showing his work. The New York Times journalist who wrote about this fashion show on film described the models as drifting across the screen as goddesses from the machine. So the film magically brought people into the garden of Paul Poiret's couture house, showing off these beautiful garments in this very gorgeous and kind of dreamlike way, which were amazingly in color. And so this is the other point of what I want to get at. So we don't have this film. The film doesn't exist. We have some accounts of it. We have some Poiret, garments that exist. So you can make some of these comparisons, but it does kind of speak to a lot of these challenges that we've encountered in putting this exhibition together. So I'm going to walk you through the basic layout of the exhibition. As you saw from the previous slide of at the Bard Graduate Center is on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It is in a townhouse, and so it's a very vertical space. And so we're kind of using that as the way we organize the exhibition. So we're working on the cinema experience, then you're going to go up and see fashion designers and costume designers on film. And then the top floor is going to be all about movement and energy and dance. So that's kind of the general layout of the exhibition. And I'm going to show you some of the pieces that are in the show and how we're going to kind of bring the viewer into the silent era. So one thing we do really want to capture is this idea of the magic of going to the movies. And so the exhibition actually stretches from, like you see, this John Sloan print from 1905, called Fun 1 Cent, where they're looking at the kinetoscope or the peep show kind of viewers, all the way through to the late 1920s, and we even like dip a toe into the talkies. But we want people to kind of get a sense of what it was like to actually go into a theater. So the first gallery is going to try to evoke that through images like this, as well as kind of bring a little bit of humor into the exhibition as well. We will have some garments in this part of the exhibition, and we will have some of these very large picture hats. And so I think what I found so kind of wonderful about this period is that in the kind of beginning of this moment, there was kind of this general kind of lack of understanding about how you should behave in a movie theater. So there are a lot of these PSAs or public service announcements kind of just telling people how they should kind of act and behave. And so one of them was, ladies, kindly remove your hats. And here's this really wonderful glass slide that acted as a PSA because these hats in this era could get 2 to 3 feet in diameter. They are absolutely gigantic. This is a really wonderful blue velvet one from a private collector who's lending quite a bit to the exhibition. So, and this is something that kind of goes on through the 19-teens for sure. I have a lot of wonderful glass slides here from the Start Thursday glass slide collection, but there is some really fantastic imagery related to this. And there's also, of course, many other kind of PSAs related to no spitting on the floor and please don't smoke as well. And I love this one on the right, which is the mirror in the lobby is for the convenience of the ladies when putting on their hats, which is to try to encourage them to put them on when they leave rather than before they're departing the cinema. So we'll also have a number of really wonderful images that again kind of evoke what cinema going was like in these early days. This is a series that was done by George Right Hand handwrite, for the Harper's Magazine. And it's entitled The Matinee Line is a Study in Democracy. And you see this kind of wide range of people who are going, which was very kind of typical of that period in particular. In the early days, it was kind of trying to gain in respectability. And you'll see that from music sheets like this. So this music sheet it says, if that's your idea of a wonderful time, take me home. So this is a 19 teens music sheet. And again, it's kind of like this idea that going to the movies wasn't something that you did if you were of a certain socioeconomic class. And so what we see when we kind of look at this stretch of time that we're covering in the exhibition is how that shifts and changes over time, how the movie-going experience changes as well. And one of the objects that speaks to that is this woman's usher uniform from the 1920s from the Victoria and Albert Museum collection, which is quite wonderful and quite rare. But it also represents kind of this moment where they're trying to elevate that cinema-going experience by having ushers who are clothed in certain ways, who are bringing people to their seats. And if you know anything about this era, you know that these grand movie palaces were really quite wonderfully decorated and really, kind of wonderful experiences once they became designated theaters for film. So fashion designers on film is a section that will address this kind of blurry line between fashion and costume in the early days of cinema. So I'm showing you this image of Gloria Swanson on the left, who was, when she first tried out for S&A Films in the early 19-teens, she writes about how she wore what she considered her best ensemble, and it was what she called an Irene Castle design. So Irene Castle, who I'll talk about quite a bit in this presentation, was one of the foremost proponents of modern dance in the era. And she and her husband Vernon were sensations, and they popularized ragtime rhythms, syncopated rhythms, both on the stage and on the screen. And so she was the fashion icon of this moment. And Gloria Swanson was looking to her as to how to dress. But one of the important points is that she had to, kind of walk in knowing how to present herself and knowing how to dress herself to have the film company pay any attention to her. So this is from the Harry Ransom Center, from the Gloria Swanson Archive, which is down at the University of Texas at Austin. And it's really full of all these wonderful images from her early days in cinema. So there was kind of this blurred line in terms of how clothing was provided, the establishment of wardrobe departments in these early days, and that's something we will delve into. But this section in particular addresses fashion designers who were involved in film from the earliest days. And a lot of this is centered in New York, because as many of you know, the film industry was centered in New York for quite a bit of time until the move to the West Coast in the 19-teens. But a lot of these very famous fashion designers in New York were patronized by these actresses. And so they would then bring their clothing, to be worn on film. Or if they were somebody like Lillian Gish, she could specify which designers she wanted to wear. So Lillian Gish in Way Down East, that's the image you see here. There were a number of designers who provided garments for this very, very famous blockbuster film. This dress in particular was made by Henry Bendel, which was a small department store, but which had its own in-house designers. So this is this really wonderful negligee that she wears in a very pivotal scene in the movie. It is at the Museum of the City of New York collection. I'm really excited to get this out. We have 2 garments coming from Way Down East, which have never been exhibited before. They're incredibly fragile. As I mentioned, that fragility is really an issue for us with this exhibition. But really quite beautiful. And it's also always interesting to me to see the difference between the actual garment and how it appears on film, because there are these decisions that are being made from a design perspective. So this is this really wonderful kind of ethereal negligee that will be in the exhibition. The fantastic thing about Way Down East is that it kind of runs the gamut in terms of the actual plot line, because it has kind of action, it has adventure, it has morality, and it also has a fashion show they're just thrown right into the middle of into the film. And so there's this really wonderful scene with Lillian Gish wearing this dress, which was also a dress designed by Henry Bendel, also in the Museum of the City of New York collection. And she is kind of trying to present herself. She's a bit of a country bumpkin, and she's trying to learn how to present herself in this kind of upper crust environment. And so she has this dress that she's wearing. She's trying to learn how to walk in it. But what's really interesting to me too about this exhibition is, about this film, is that there are a number of designers who were providing garments to this movie. So it was Henry Bendel, it was Lucille, Lady Duff Gordon, who I'll speak about as well. Ferragamo provided the shoes. None of these are credited. It's very, very hard to find out who provided what for various films. Credit is not very common until late 19 teens into the 20s. And even then, I've watched films in the 30s that don't have credit. But you can see from this close-up that I took in the Museum of the City of New York storage facility that the fragility is so clear. A lot of these garments in this period are made of these very lightweight fabrics, and then they're beaded, and the weight of the beads or the feathers or the fur weigh down the garment. And so it's very challenging to figure out how to exhibit these, but we're working on it. So Lady Duff Gordon was one of the premier suppliers of clothing to the New York fashion film industry. She was a force to be reckoned with in terms of her own success, and really was considered one of the premier couture designers of the period. So Canadian born, she had a couture house in London, and then she opened her house in America in the 19 teens. And any actress who could afford her would wear her garments. But she was also incredibly smart in terms of her own approach to the film industry. She knew that this new medium would have such widespread attention. And so she realized it was just a great promotional vehicle for her. And she, like many of the fashion designers of this period, started out providing garments for actresses on the stage. And so this was kind of a natural transition for her, because a lot of these actresses from the stage and from Broadway and from burlesque were actually also transitioning into film. So they would bring their kind of preferred designers with them. So she eventually dressed over 100 films. She was the subject of many kind of fashion newsreels or fashion shows on films. She was really smart in terms of marketing. She claims to have invented the fashion show. It's not necessarily the case, but she was really good at promoting her models, like actresses were promoted. She created what she called gowns of emotion or dream dresses, and she gave them very evocative names like "Why Do You Hesitate?" or "Yes or No." So the garment on the right is a dress worn by Irene Castle, who I've already mentioned. She loved this dress and wore it repeatedly. So she first wore it in a 1914 musical by Irving Berlin called "Watch Your Step." The dress was called "Love in the Mist," and she describes it in her autobiography as this. The costume I wore opening night was probably the loveliest costume the world has ever seen. It was designed by Lady Duff Gordon, and Elsie de Wolfe likened it to a fragonard. To me, it was sheer heaven. It was the first dress with a torn hemline and was a shade of blue-grain chiffon that looked like smoke and was 12 yards around the bottom. The bodice was silver with long, full chiffon sleeves carrying a wide band of gray fox at the wrist. The cloak was made of blue-gray and silver brocade, very full in the skirt, and with a tight bodice that laced down the left side with chartreuse and emerald green satin streamers. The dress was perfect for dancing. It molded the legs and trailed out behind like smoke, giving fluid grace to anything that you did with it. So Irene Castle, as a dancer, really believed that an effectively designed garment not only melded seamlessly with the dancer's body, but it also enhanced the choreography and the dance movement as well. And when you look at this, these kind of dream dresses were actually indeed somewhat radical and novel because they're less constricted design compared to the Edwardian silhouette that you see on Lady Duff Gordon here was really quite new. And also the diaphanous layers and some of the details were inspired by these at-home lounging attires or attire negligees. So she, as I mentioned, costumed over 100 films and very smartly also designed and provided garments for actresses such as Billie Burke, who starred in Gloria's Romance. I think many of you know about these serials of the early cinema. So these serial dramas were these cliffhanger style dramas that you would go back to the cinema to see every week or every other week, and they were kind of a lot of them were short, kind of one reel, you know. Plots, but it kept bringing you back. And so if you're dressing a serial as a fashion designer, of course, your work is getting out there constantly, but you can get a sense for the design and kind of the dreaminess of her dresses in this garment as well as this one. So this one will be in the show. Again, it's as I've mentioned, it's really hard to find the actual garments worn on film for this period. Most have deteriorated or haven't been saved. But this one is from the Hillwood Museum and Gardens. It is a 1916 Lucille dress, and it's very similar to the ones that Billie Burke was wearing in Gloria's Romance. So we're going to be doing a little bit of comparison there. The other designer I wanted to talk about was Madame Frances, who is a designer who, like Lucille, started dressing clients for the stage. She was very, very well known in her time. She was a New York-based fashion designer. She worked very closely with the film industry. There were so many actresses of the stage and screen who were big fans of her work and were clients of her work. So Valeska Surratt is one. We have a chapter about Valeska in our exhibition book. Irene Castle, the Talmadge sisters, who you see on the right, Anita Lose and Frances Marion. So it really became this kind of like central place for providing these garments for the film industry. And she, interestingly, Anita Lose wrote about her work, very similar to Lucille's as well, that Madame Frances's garments promised little Park Avenue restraint and also had these very evocative titles like The Branded Woman or The Isle of Conquest or The Passion Flower. So here's one image of her work. This is from the film Yes or No from 1920. These are designs, we believe, by Madame Frances. Again, the credit is very rare. It's really hard to find that information, but there are mentions in film serials and magazines of the time, as well as some information that you get from, you know, for example, Anita Lose's book or other kinds of firsthand accounts of the period. So this is a really interesting one. It's a very typical silhouette of the era, this robe de style, which has got kind of these flared panniers that are very much inspired by the 18th century. But you can also get a sense for, again, how this extreme fragility is an issue with a garment such as this. Madame Frances also dressed this movie called Mademoiselle Modiste, so 1926. And what I love about this comparison here is that, you know, here's a very graphic poster. Here is this really wonderful glass slide from the Sturts Thursday collection again. And you get a little bit more of a sense for how that garment looked. This is another lost film, so we don't have any garments from it. We don't even have the film. We're, again, kind of trying to kind of piece this together for the exhibition. We will have a lot of film clips. It's a very film heavy exhibition and will really be this kind of mixed media installation where we'll be showing posters, we'll be showing glass slides, we'll be showing film clips where we have them, we'll be showing garments where we have them, as well as magazines. So, and other sorts of imagery, film stills, lobby cards. So we're really calling upon all these different kind of media to try to recreate and re-envision what this looked like in that period. Madame Francis's dress are again very rare, very difficult to find, which is surprising because she had a pretty robust career until I mean she sold the business in the late 20s, just as um, film started crediting designers. So there's just not much out there. But if you look at the work is absolutely spectacular. She was a very, very high-end couture designer. Her own story is very much about, this like an immigrant story of somebody kind of rising up through the ranks, using her business as a way to kind of find her way in the world. And she was incredibly successful, and eventually married one of the producers and an NBC executive, and eventually kind of shuttered the business. But her work is really wonderful and really worth delving into because of her involvement with the film industry. We will also cover designers who really haven't had much attention. So this is a really fascinating story of Odessa Warren Gray, who is a milliner and fashion designer turned actress from Harlem. So she is in Lime Kiln Club Field Day from 1913, which is a relatively recent discovery in the Museum of Modern Art collection. We have a biography of her in the book, written by Avery Laflamme, who's doing his dissertation on Odessa. And what I find fascinating is that it's just so hard to find information about anything related to her history, even though she had a decades-long career in Harlem with a very successful millinery fashion shop, following her starring in Odessa, or partially co-starring in Lime Kiln Club Field Day, and having this relatively successful business. So we don't know that she created these clothes, but it's likely she provided her own garments, which again was quite common at the time. She stars in this with Burt Williams, who you see on the right, very famous actor from the period. So again, we're trying to kind of bring some of this to light through the exhibition. And shoes will also be covered in the exhibition. I. Miller is another incredible story of a business that aligned itself with the theater and the film world to great benefit, great financial benefit, great promotional benefit. So I. Miller, this is an image of their building, which is in Times Square. It still exists. It has been landmarked. The building was built specifically for I. Miller shoes. Israel Miller started out quite early on providing shoes for the theater industry. And then it quickly grew, and it's amazing when you start really delving into how many kind of vaudeville and burlesque and Broadway productions he provided shoes for. He does get credit in some of these magazines, and he is providing for the whole troupe. And so he realized the benefit of doing this. And so this building that he built, the flagship store in New York City, as you can see from the top, it says the Show Folks Shoe Shop, dedicated to beauty and footwear. And one thing he did that was so fascinating is he actually crowdsourced those little statues that are in those vignettes are various film and theater stars. So Mary Pickford is up there as kind of a favorite of the screen. Rosa Poncell is up there. There are 4 different people from the stage, the screen, opera, and comedy as well. And you can see from the shoes, very, very beautifully produced. He was incredibly successful. He expanded into Chicago, across the country. He opened up his own shoe store in Hollywood as well. And we will have a small section kind of devoted to I. Miller's story. So the top floor of the exhibition is going to be completely dedicated to movement and kineticism on film, which is not surprising given kind of what film was capturing at that moment. It specifically revolves around women on film in 2 ways. One is through these serial dramas, so serial queens and these women of action and the clothing that they wore for these films. As well as dance. So I'll talk kind of a little bit about the serial queens and the women of action and the kind of garments we have related to that. And then we'll talk about dance. So here you see Ruth Rowland in The Timber Queen. Love this image because not only are they filming it, but you kind of get the idea of like this action, like the like really intense action of these movies. So there were women in these serial dramas who were, they were on the top of trains, they were racing trains, they were driving cars, they were piloting airplanes. They were driving boats. They were diving off of cliffs. I mean, it's this incredibly intense action and activity and athleticism. And so we're try to find kind of clothing that corresponded to that, some which is related to certain screen stars. And so on the right is this really wonderful riding ensemble of Mabel Normans from the FIDM ASU Museum in Los Angeles. And when women were participating in this kind of action, they had to wear more practical garments. So it's really very much about this modernization of, kind of the women's movement, and also this like more increased participation in sports, in social activities, in the world, in work more generally. And so you see that reflected in these films. And, this is 1914, The Perils of Pauline with Pearl White. Interestingly, the designer Lucille Lady Duff Gordon clothed Pearl White for a lot of the serial. It was a runaway success. There were over 100 of these serials made in the 19 teens and into the 1920s. And of course, as a serial, there are multiple kind of versions of it. So anyway, it's again this incredible vehicle for kind of getting your designs out there. But you can get a sense for kind of the type of activity in which these serial queens were participating. There's more here. Ruth Rowland, again, in The Timber Queen, she's trying to climb up the train and do what she needs to do. But the clothing is very specific, right? And it's the kind of clothing that's, again, hard to find because the more practical garments often don't survive, but we've managed to pull some together. And then on the right, you see Pearl White again in The Perils of Pauline, wearing this really amazing, these kind of jodhpurs, high boots, and this leather jacket ensemble. So we're really trying to get at like how this impacted movement, how the clothing impacted movement, and how this really contributed to this idea of the modern woman. So Annette Kellerman is another one who is very, very famous swimmer from Australia, who was a big proponent of more practical swimwear for women. And you can see even from this 1920s swimsuit in the middle that it's got a little bit of breathing room. But if you pair that with stockings and a cap and shoes, and you're trying to swim in these wool bathing suits, it's really tough and it's really weighing you down. So Annette Kellerman, who also starred in many films, was a big proponent of the one piece for women and the sleekly designed and form-fitted one piece for women. The reason I'm showing you this garment in particular is because Annette Kellerman starred in Neptune's Daughter. The name of this garment is Neptune's Daughter. That's the brand of the bathing suit, which again was supposed to be more practical, allowed for more movement and ease. This is a film called The Flying Ace from 1926, which again, the film, we will have the poster, we'll have a clip from the film, but again, talking about kind of the garments that were needed for this kind of activity. So the cap and the goggles, which again, very practical. It's also like this moment in time where the whole body is being streamlined in really interesting ways, all the way to the top of the head, where everything needs to be more contained and more practical for wear. This is another great object called the Mary Pickford cap, which was kind of promoted as something that could be worn for all sorts of practical reasons. So if you look at the ad, it's ideal for streetwear, motoring, skating, golfing, all outdoor sports. But you had to contain your hair in some way, which is what this tries to do. And you can see Mary Pickford in A Beast at Bay in 1912 wearing something similar. But, all of this activity really engendered these new forms of dress. So dance is the last section of the exhibition. This is a film still from this. So this is Paris from 1925, which just has this incredible frenetic energy. It's really, really fantastic. And again, when we look at dance, we will cover Irene Castle again because she and Vernon were such important promoters of these new rhythms and this new style of movement that was much more expressive in the 19 teens than these kind of formal waltzes of the previous era. So even from a very, very early moment, they were mostly working kind of on stage together and performing on stage, but they were being filmed and being shown in the 19 teens in theaters. And then Irene Castle, even though there hasn't been too much written about her film career, but she did have a very vibrant film career and starred in, multiple films over the course of her kind of the early 1920s. So you can see some of these here, Slim Shoulders. She's wearing that dress that she loves so much in the lower left. And then No Trespassing is another one, and which also kind of were very lightly disguised as fashion shows because she was considered one of the, kind of premier fashion icons of the moment. And so then if we look at a film like So This Is Paris, you can also get a sense for this very intense obsession with legs, which occurs throughout the 19 teens and certainly into the 20s. So when you think about 1920s dress and you think about this exposing of the legs for the first time in a long time, you kind of understand the obsession. And so films of this era are just full of this energy and this intense freneticism that's also related to the music of that period. So we go from ragtime to jazz, and the jazz rhythms are even faster and even more kind of dissonant in a way. And you see that reflected in these films. So this I love. This is one of the set designs by Harold Grieve for So This Is Paris, and legs are the visual trope for the entire set for the dance scene in So This Is Paris. It's really worth watching. It's online. You can see it. But here you can kind of get a sense for how they made lamps. They made tables. Like everything revolved about this idea of moving legs. And so we will kind of show some of that in the exhibition. I'm also really delighted that we're going to be showing this Circe the Enchantress dress from 1924 from the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. Again, it has been out, but not that often. It has, again, a wonderful, wonderful dance scene that's full of just fantastic energy. I want to point out her shoes, which were called tango slippers or tango shoes. So one thing that kind of had to adapt in addition to the garments was the shoes, because you really had to be able to keep your shoes on your feet when you're moving at this increased pace. And so there are really interesting things that kind of evolved out of that. Those tango slippers that I showed you, these were an invention in the 1920s called spans, and they were actually jeweled pieces you could buy that would attach to your shoe to keep it on your foot while you were dancing. And I just find it fascinating that you kind of see evidence of people grappling with how do we deal with this increased activity? How do we make this work? And I know I'm getting a little close to time, so I'm going to try to wrap it up. But so the other thing that was, of course, an issue is hair. So when you think about Belle Epoque era, Edwardian era, women's hair was quite long and luxurious and these large kind of almost pompadour style hairdos. And so again, people like Irene Castle were really promoting this idea that short hair was okay, bobbed hair was okay. This Dutch cap, which she called this Dutch cap, which is at the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising ASU collection, was something she wore to keep her hair in place. But then eventually she cut her hair, and she was one of the first people to cut her hair. And here you see a little note: in my garden at home before everyone had seen my short hair in public. So it was actually fairly dramatic to cut your hair until you kind of move into the 1920s. And there are a number of films that revolve around this, which I think is really quite funny. There are a lot of scenes where women are kind of, they're like, what signifies their modernity is actually cutting their locks. And so there's a film called Bobbed Hair from 1922. We will be showing Mary Pickford's curls. So, when you think about Mary Pickford, she is the girl with the curls. She's like this wholesome all-American young girl, this very girlish persona, screen persona, and she cut her hair, and it was really, really quite dramatic. And not all of her fans appreciated it. But there were also other types of head forms and hats that evolved out of this, including these really fantastic metallic wigs, these bandeaus or headache bands, and then these cloches, which again, when you think about the streamlining of the form, it basically in the 1920s, you're turning your head into a sphere and the body into this tubular column, but it does allow for a lot more activity. So Hollywood costume design, we will also cover kind of the early days and looking at really this transition from a period where there were established costume departments quite early, but they weren't kind of as professionalized until later. And so some of the garments that will kind of address that are beautiful garments like this one from Male and Female from 1919, worn by Gloria Swanson. This one had a number of designers working on it, including Claire West, who was one of the really early and important designers who was credited more than some of the other designers in this period. So I'm very excited that we'll be showing this. Here are some of Claire West's sketches for a movie called For Sale, from also from the Natural History Museum of LA. So we're really going to try to get at that process and think about, how what designers were grappling with when they were trying to present these garments on film, because there were so many considerations. Color didn't look the same on a black and white film as it did kind of in person. We're also really excited to be featuring the work of Lillian St. Cyr, who was a consultant as well as a costume designer, and this piece was shown in The Squaw Man as well as was used in a number of other films. And it's coming from the Wisconsin Historical Society, and it's really exciting to kind of tell her story. She was a Ho-Chunk woman who starred in some of the films and then continued to be a consultant for Native American dress for the rest of her life, really. Will feature work like designer Natasha Rambova, her work for Valentino in Blood and Sand from 1922, as well as designers such as David Cox, who again started quite early, again, not credited as much, but this really amazing 1920 garment for Louise Glaum, who was one of the really early vamps of the period. And it's this fantastic spider-themed garment that's worn in the film. And David Cox, goes on to do a lot in Hollywood, including dressing Joan Crawford in Our Dancing Daughters with this Cubist-inspired garment that she wears in this kind of seminal dance scene, doing the Charleston on a table. And again, shoes are part of the story, and one that's not often told. So George Brzezinski is a really fascinating story of an immigrant designer who comes to Hollywood and really tries to sell his craft to the Hollywood film industry. And he does eventually start providing shoes for a number of different studios. He did design shoes for Intolerance and Salome. There's this really amazing, and I'm very excited to get it out and show it, wonderful boot model he made on the right-hand side. That's a miniature boot that he used as like a salesman sample to sell his craft. So we'll be showing that in the exhibition as well. And then Salvatore Ferragamo's Hollywood Boot Shop. Again, Ferragamo is an interesting story because he is Italian. He's an Italian immigrant. He comes to America to kind of learn how to make mass-produced shoes. He does not like mass-produced shoes, so he ends up going to the West Coast and opening up his Hollywood boot shop and becoming the favorite of a number of different actresses, and as well as providing for a number of different films. And then he takes what he learns in Hollywood in terms of promotion and goes back to Italy. Travis Banton designed this dress for Esther Ralston in Fashions for Women in 1927. Again, it's a lost film. It's a really beautiful garment. It was also used for pointed heels with Adrienne Dore. This is coming from the Paramount archives. And also just to kind of get to this point of how these garments have other lives, right? I mean, it's a spectacular object, but it also is something that did get reuse over time. And hopefully one of the reasons it may have been preserved. But one thing I wanted to point out is that kind of to wrap things up is that when we look at kind of these earlier days of the 19 teens and kind of this a bit of a nebulous situation in terms of who's providing garments and fashion designers being involved in film, and yet, when it actually appears on the screen, it kind of moves into this classification as costume. And yet the professionalization of the industry and certainly of costume design generally takes a while to kind of, be put into place. But I think The Dressmaker from Paris is a great example of what happens when it finally does, and when Hollywood starts to really kind of create its own mythology and its own sense of style and its own special form of glamour. So The Dressmaker from Paris was designed by Howard Greer and Travis Banton, who worked for Lucille, by the way, Lady Duff Gordon. So the connections are very tight. But he wrote in his autobiography that Vogue and Harper's Bazaar could bleat about the chemise dress, then the dernier cry in Paris, but in Hollywood, skin-tight dresses were de rigueur. The belt was where God meant your middle to be, and not draped around the fanny. Every curve and muscle was proudly emphasized. Of course, Paris, in its slow-moving cycle of changing whims, would eventually catch up to all the circus glitter and sex emphasis, but a lot of sartorial water was to run out of the bridge before it happened. And so you can look at this garment from on the right from The Dressmaker from Paris and see where this division was happening between fashion and Hollywood costume. And then I'll just end with this quote by Anita Loos, who said, during those early years, we had little respect for a métier that we looked down on as a passing fad. Nobody ever dreamed those images one day would start to speak. And maybe this is one of the reasons that we have so little that is preserved in terms of the material culture of this era. And then I just want to, again, give a shout out to my co-curator, Emma Cormick, give you a little bit of a sneak peek of the book, which is coming out when the exhibition opens. So we've got a number of authors participating. We've got a number of subjects that we're covering within the book. So it's very exciting to kind of see this all come into play. And then just as a reminder, September 18th, it opens to the public and it will be up through January 3rd. And I hope I can see you there. So thank you all for being here. I'm really happy to have participated.
Wow. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Michelle. I can't wait for the exhibit. We do have time for some questions, so let's take a look and see what questions some people might have. Okay. Just Q&A. Okay. No questions. I'm shocked. Okay. I'm gonna see if there's any questions. Sometimes people put their questions in the chat.
In the chat.
So yeah. So let me go, because we did have a question at the beginning, which I thought was a great question, which was why were they called picture hats when you were talking about those awful hats?
Oh, that's a very good question. Yes, and I have to say I'm not sure if I know exactly why they were called picture hats. I don't think it has anything to do with film, but I think it does have to do with the scale potentially. I mean, it's just there's something about it. It takes up so much space, but it's a good question. I'll have to look into that one. Thank you for that. I've seen the references so much, but I've never really delved into why.
Yeah. I don't know. Okay. Let's see. Any questions coming through? Aha. What did women do with their giant hats after they took them off? Did the theaters have a hat room?
Yeah,
great question.
That is a great question. And I did see reference to something being designed like into the seats where there was a place for your hat to rest. So that was, I don't know if many theaters had that, but I did see some reference to that. And there were also, I think you could potentially check it. I'm not sure, but I think you also had to put it in your lap. I think that's eventually what you ended up doing. But there were also PSAs about men's hats as well, because men would also, everybody wore hats when they walked out the door, of all classes, of all socioeconomic groups. It was just really like the standard attire. And so a lot of people are wearing hats. And so even the men were told to take the hats off. But
Okay, we have another really great question. How
mhm,
did the fashions, I assume they're talking about the fashions in the films,
mhm.
affect female attendance in cinemas?
Okay, I'm so glad you asked that because I meant to use that as a transition when I was going to the fashion designers on film and this idea of elevating the cinema experience. Because one thing that filmmakers did in that period very specifically was think about targeting women to get women viewers into the theater. And the way they often did that, because then it would help bring the respectability up a level. And so the way they did that was to focus on fashion. And so they often advertised, you will see the latest in gowns and you will see your favorite designer or a designer you admire in these films. And so there's a lot of this fashion focus that actually feeds into this notion of bringing women into the theater. The women are coming, they'll bring their children, so it does, that does have a big impact. So it's a great question.
Okay, wonderful. Here's
Mhm.
another. Um, you mentioned the costumes were lightweight. Was that to reduce cost or to stay cooler?
Oh, that's a good question. So I wouldn't say it was specifically about cost because a lot of these very sheer fabrics and silks and chiffons were not inexpensive. I mean, textiles generally were very costly. But it's just that this period, there's a propensity and kind of this visual interest or aesthetic interest in these very kind of sheer diaphanous garments. It's just part of the period look, particularly in the 19 teens. So it's not driven specifically by cost or even heat or them being overheated. It's just kind of partially the style of the period. Because I've watched a lot of these films and I see a lot of these, and I'm sure other people have. You see a lot of these actors in really heavy duty wool, and you think they must be burning up because like the lights and the
Mhm.
activity and everything. So it was really part of the era's, kind of look.
So, thanks for that. Now, here's a question. Given credits for designers were sparse in the
Mhm.
1910s and 20s, can you talk a little more about your research methodology in discovering those designers?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, great question. So, well, it's been kind of a long process. And I think that one of the ways I originally did the research, because we're talking 20 years ago,
Mhm.
was to look at microfiche and look at a lot of these film magazines and look for specific references to designers being mentioned or designers as providing garments for film. Now, of course, with the expansion of all of this material online, you can go to Lantern Media and you can go to some of these other sources and you can find more information about all these designers. But originally, it really was like an archaeological dig. It was really like very piecemeal. And now I look back at my book and I'm like, oh, I know so much more. And there's so much more out there now. Um, and the other thing I have to say, and I'm sure for this crowd, because they're so enmeshed and involved in this world, is that there are some credits, like periodically you'll see them. And even when I was at like the Pordenone Film Festival in 2022 and seeing some of those films for the first time, every now and then you'll get a credit and you'll realize, oh, like the costume credit, and it hasn't been recorded anywhere. So that's part of the issue, right? So some of these, you kind of have to just keep watching and keep looking. But a lot of it did come from film magazines. Some of it came from other archives like, okay, Gloria Swanson Archive, University of Texas at Austin, memoirs, oral histories, as well as the specific designer archive. So like Lucille Lady Duff Gordon, there's an archive at the museum at FIT, and there are photographs in that and designs that specifically relate to Billie Burke, for example. So that's kind of how I started.
Great.
Mhm.
Thank you. Oh, questions are starting to come in thick and
Okay,
fast. So this is
good.
one of those sort of chicken and the egg questions, but I think it's
Mhm.
it's relevant. Were the
Yeah.
clothes designers' appearance in the films considered the main form of advertising, or were there advertisements that were basically
Ah,
as seen in this movie look like your favorite stars? So, yeah, which came first, or maybe
which came first? Yeah, which came first? I mean, I think it kind of varied. I think that the advertisements often were kind of released in tandem with the film, but sometimes there would be, pre-promotion, right? So you would get ads that would come out before the film was shown. So yeah, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg, but there was definitely a lot of that cross promotion happening. And it wasn't just happening with the advertisement. It was the advertisements. There was a lot of very targeted cross promotion that was going on with department stores, with other types of fashion stores. So a lot of these distribution companies, the film distributors, would promote this idea that you could set up really fabulous scenes in your store window promoting this film with this
Mhm.
designer. And that was very much, that was happening very early on as well.
All right, amazing. Um, Here's another question and a comment. It's
Mhm.
absolutely fantastic to see African American and Native American fashion being included. I do have a
Mhm.
small question. What
Mhm.
about cross dressing? Were the
Mhm.
garments made by these designers that you've mentioned?
Mhm. It's a great question and one I didn't delve into here, but I should have. But we will have not necessarily cross dress. Well, we do have a chapter written by Laura Horak, who is specifically addressing, yeah, the kind
She
of
was my TA.
yeah, well, really? That's fantastic. Yeah. So anyway, she has written this really wonderful chapter specifically on women and masculine attire on film. And so, like a lot of those serial heroines, for example, you'll see a lot of that happening. We do also have a woman's tuxedo from the 19 teens because that is something that was very prevalent. And actually, you see, I mean, Gloria Swanson, you see a lot of different stars of that period in the 19 teens wearing, you know, tuxedos or tails as part of these different kinds of characters on film. So it is definitely part of the story in the exhibition and certainly a really big part of the book.
Great. Um, Here's a question I find interesting. Were
Mm.
hobble skirts ever used in films, maybe in
Um,
comedies?
yes, they were. And there's actually a number of comedies that came out in the teens. Again, they don't exist. They don't exist anymore. But I've seen reference as early as 1910 to films specifically that address the hobble skirt and the absurdity of it. And even in a really popular film like Intolerance, there's a scene in Intolerance where Gish tries to imitate the current style and she kind of wraps a little belt around her legs and she's trying to move, So yeah, it is. I mean, all of these styles, so the big, the gigantic hats, the hobble skirts, the kind of lampshade tunics and harem pants, all of that was the subject of satire in film. And I do have in the book and in the exhibition a piece on Tilly's Punctured Romance, which satirizes some of the kind of Paris couture that's coming overseas and how limiting it really is for movement. So yeah, it's all over silent film in that era.
Great. And we unfortunately we just have time for one more question.
Mm.
It's a bit of a general one.
Okay.
In what ways did women's film costumes differ from everyday fashion of the silent era?
Hmm. Yep, it's a very good question. And also a little hard to answer because, as I've mentioned, it's like a very gray area in this moment in time in terms of Actresses, some needed to provide their own garments. It was written into their contract. And so they would have to provide a riding ensemble and an evening dress and a day dress and, whatever it might be. So there's certainly in the 19 teens, it's a little bit unclear, but and so anyway, it's a little hard to decipher, but I do think that there's something to be said for once it's on the screen, it becomes something else, right? So like that is kind of my fallback in a way. But there was a lot of reality in those films in that moment in time, and particularly in the kind of earlier days, because you did have actresses providing their own, you did have some of them working with these designers. So it just kind of varies and it depends on the film really as well.
Well, thank you again, Michelle, so much for your fabulous presentation. Can't wait to see the exhibit. And thanks to all the attendees for the wonderful questions and your attendance. I'd like to invite you all to join us for next month's edition of Online with SFFP, which will be presented by Aurora Spears, speaking about her new book, Archiving the Past, Women's Film History in France, 1927 to 1978, which kind of is an interesting tie-in, consider that fashion was such a big
Yeah.
part of, French culture and film. This event will take place on Friday, February 20th, and I hope you can all join us then. And once again, thanks, Michelle, and hope to see your show in the fall.
Yeah, please come. It was really wonderful to be here. Thank you for asking me.
All right. Take
Okay,
care.
have a great night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.